incredible Second World War vehicles. We're a bit used to seeing tanks. Some of you down here perhaps for the first time. Some of you, if you've seen some of these tanks running around before, you know we've got some amazing things that run. But where else in the world are you going to see a running Hargo? You're not. So this one here coming on, this is a Japanese tank designed in the early 1930s. Often compared to the Stuart tank, the Americans. Actually, it's almost a decade ahead of the Stuart. Now, what you get with a Hargo tank is designed by what sounds like an Irish comedian. His name's Tomio Ahara. He's actually the Japanese tank designer. He comes up with a requirement is issued by the Japanese military. They've already got tanks in service. They've bought some tanks from Britain. They bought what looked like a Vickers medium tank. It had an engine fire. Some of the crew were burnt. So they decide in Japan they're going to go for diesel. So this has actually got a Mitsubishi diesel engine in the back. It's got a 37mm gun. It's not that high velocity. It's got a new suspension system developed by Tomio Ahara. It's called a bell crank suspension system, and they put it into production. It sees action from the late 1930s onwards, and it's very successful from the point of view of the Japanese, because basically it's not fighting much other armour. The Japanese then concentrate their resources on building ships, because again, as a maritime nation, island hopping, tanks take second place in their design process. Now, we brought out our M3 Stuart, bit of a comparison because scale-wise and certainly in terms of the early fighting, this is one of the tanks that the Japanese bumped into. Stuart's first used in the Philippines against the Japanese. Those two tanks actually, you know, often, as I say, compared, that they are a different time scale. The Japanese are putting the Hargo into production in the early 1930s. It's seeing action later. The Americans, we'll talk about the Americans a bit more as well with the Sherman in a while, but basically 20s and 30s, they only build experimental vehicles. They are not putting tanks into major production. The heads of the American Army, whenever Congress comes along and slashes their budget in the Depression era, they try to hang on to men, so in other words, personnel, and not worry about building equipment. But they test things, and they test suspension systems, they test engines, they trial different sorts of vehicles, but don't put much into production. They follow up, they follow the British. They have a small mechanised force experiment in 1930, but finally, when they realise war's coming, only then do they commit for what is called standard production. In other words, the vehicle is given a stamp, and instead of being an experimental or a T vehicle, it becomes an M vehicle, hence M3. It's the third model light tank the Americans decide to build. Radial air engine in the back, which means it's got to be high, 37mm gun as well, and very quickly they realise it's a bit cramped, it's a bit hot, it's a bit sweaty. So many of these American vehicles, though, the great thing is they can develop them. And later in the war, you end up with a version of this called the M5. And how do you tell the difference? Look at that stepped front. The driver is looking forward on this earlier version. The later ones, his head comes out a hatch on the top with a big steep glacé plate on the front there. So there's two adversaries, both absolutely rare classic, early war, that one, M3 there, the Hargo, found on a Pacific island, restored by Oliver Barnum and his team. Go over and have a chat, you can see that later on. Talk about their development, very original. There was lots of things in that vehicle when it was recovered. They'd still got magazine racks with ammunition in, things like that on the inside of it. Lined with asbestos, can you believe, to try and keep the heat down inside. Luckily that's all been stripped out, you'll be pleased to know, so the crew's okay in there. And the other one to look out for on that Hargo as well, on the back, there's a load of rivets. One of those rivets is actually a button. If you press down on that rivet, it rings a bell so you get the driver's attention. So you don't order up a drink or anything, it's just if you're the infantry following, you know that you can communicate with the driver. Now, talk about other rarities, absolutely unique, the only one and remaining complete Valentine DD tank. So this is what all the Allied crews trained on before D-Day. They actually land in Sherman DD tanks. What's a DD? If you're looking at the rear of the tank, duplex drive, it can drive by its tracks or it can drive by using the propeller on the rear. And the whole idea, Nicholas Straussler, in the 20s, I mean, even before the 20s, end of the First World War, the British are trying to float a Mark 9. We have a Mark 9 in our First World War hall. They're trying to float that tank on a lake outside London. Same lake in 1940, they start experiments with Nicholas Straussler. How are we going to float a tank? How does it get across rivers? How are we going to let that tank come across off for a landing craft? Because we know the infantry, when we get back into Europe, are going to need fire support very quickly on the beaches. So we're going to have to land a tank somehow. So Nicholas Straussler is an emigre Hungarian working in Britain. He comes up with the idea, first of all, of flotation tanks, too wide to go on a landing craft, very vulnerable. Then he thinks of the idea, let's have a flotation screen. If you raise the screen up, it displaces enough water to allow the vehicle to float. So in 41, he starts off with he's given a Tetrarch-like tank, he floats that. He then moves on to the Valentine, quarter of British tank production in World War II of Valentines. Reliable, well armoured, it was going to be the Mark III infantry tank, we used it as a cruiser. It works, it's a really good tank for the British to be using. We give them Canadian production of the Valentine, goes over to the Russians. But Straussler puts that screen around it. And the idea is you can raise that screen, that canvas, and it means this vehicle can float. And that was a vehicle they train on. They decide they want the Sherman as the actual vehicle for the landings, because if you look at the barrel on this Valentine, it goes over the screen. So the gun has to be rearwards when it's actually going ashore. So they don't use it in combat. It sees a little bit of work in Italy at the end in the Battle of the Po, but otherwise they're using the Sherman DD. You can see inside, we've got one in the museum. That's because the gun fits going forward, so they can actually fire as they're going ashore. So about the same time as the Valentine's in service, there's our Panzer III. This is a lovely warhorse tank. I mean, it's been around the places, it runs all the time, very reliable from our point of view. Is that the kiss of death? Is it about to break down? But it's one of those vehicles for us here at the Tank Museum. We're so lucky having this. We know its battle history, captured out in North Africa, Panzer L. So again, when you look at all of these books, Ausführung, Model A, Model B, Model C, normally an improvement or additions. This has gone down to the Model L. It's got extra armour bolted on the front. It was going to have another bit of extra armour on the front mount clip. It's got a 5 centimetre or 50 millimetre gun, and this one was tropicalised. They did things to it so it would see service in North Africa. And it was brought back to the UK for evaluation during the war with a number of other German tanks, some in the collection, some we gave back to the Germans some years later. And there it is running with another absolute classic British infantry tank. This is the Mark II infantry tank, the Matilda. Now the Matilda II, designed just before World War II, gets there just in time, the first of being issued to the troops in '39. It's a tank that was designed, think World War I, to support the infantry on the attack. So the idea, thick armour, don't worry too much about speed, 2-pounder gun, machine gun was probably more important than the 2-pounder. We are going to support you across what they used to call the shelled area. In other words, the bit between no man's land in World War I. We're going to drive ahead, help crush that wire down, take on the machine gun nests, and let the infantry come on behind. So Britain had decided we want cruiser tanks, faster ones that will then go through the gap. These are the ones that make the gap, and some light tanks to do recce, flank reconnaissance or flank guarding, etc. So like things like the little light 6B. But that Matilda, thick armour. And when the Germans saw the reports, Hitler in particular sees the reports of their standard 37mm anti-tank gun, you can see one of those just in front of the museum, brought along today. Those 37mm rounds bounced off the thick armour of the Matilda II. That's what led Hitler to start the Tiger program in 1941. And this was a tank that beat the Italians in O'Connor's campaign in the Western Desert, frightened the life out of the Germans in France in 1940, and went on to serve in the Far East right to the end of the war. Now basically 2 AEC bus engines in the back powering that vehicle. And one of the issues with British tanks early in the war is the idea of how do you power them. The Americans decided to use aeroplane engines. In Britain we ended up having to twin diesel bus engines to get enough power. And a bit later on, we're going to see how we came up with a solution to that by using the Spitfire engine in a tank. Now that Matilda II, thicker armour than anything else on the battlefield at the time. Bit of a tight turret, commander and gunner in there, drivers right down the front. And the driver of this is one of the chaps that helped restore it here at the museum. Go and have a look at them over the lunch break. They'll be in the tank park, some in front of the Vehicle Conservation Centre. You can have a natter to the crews, let them finish their sandwiches first or you get spat on. But go and have a word with them. You know, these are the guys that work on it. They'll be able to tell you what it's like driving some of these vehicles, because some of these vehicles, it's not so much they're just not very easy to drive, it's just you know, it's just that experience of going around in something that tiller steering, pull the right stick, goes right, pull the left stick, goes left, and trying to change gears is another one of these great arts in a tank that these are the guys having a go at. Now, there is a little bit of a tendency to always go ooh about the German vehicles and perhaps not really look at some of the British successes. And the vehicle going around now, again, just before the war, competition. We want a small scout car, that becomes the Daimler Dingo. We want a larger armoured car, that becomes this Daimler armoured car. And they had problems in the sense of manufacturing space, delays. It doesn't actually go into service till about later in 41, even though it's designed just before World War II. They're almost brother and sister vehicles, the Dingo and the Daimler. They take the turret from the Tetrarch, the light tank, 2-pounder gun in it. They've got a Daimler pre-war engine in the back. This is a very sophisticated vehicle in 1941 when it starts seeing action. It can reverse out of trouble. It's got a rear steering wheel as well. The commander can drop down, driver still presses the pedals, and he can steer backwards to get that vehicle out of trouble. But that Daimler armoured car, again, like the Dingo, very, very successful, was wheeled armour by the British forces. Now this one's something called the M16 half-track, followed by the SDKF-7 half-track. Germany and America really went to town on half-tracks in the 30s. They like the experimental. Let's try and make vehicles, wheels at the front, tracks at the back, and they took their ideas from the French Crosley Congress. Congress used to work at one point for the Tsar. He was looking at putting track vehicles together. Lots of countries like the idea of them for their off-road mobility. The German SDKFZ7, it's used to really tow guns, artillery pieces. This is a late war version of it. Again, with the Germans, as the war progresses, they have to simplify some of the build standards. So early on, you may see pictures of these with what look like seating arrangements across the back for the crew to sit on, lockers to store ammunition. Later in the war, when this one was built, they're doing a very simpler wooden body on because they need to produce them quickly. And again, with a lot of this German equipment, the best units had these as track vehicles. The vast majority of German artillery is still being towed by horses. Right the way through the war, they are not a fully mechanized army. Now, the American half-track, again, they look in the 1920s, 1930s, that age of experimentation. They have a go at trying to work out what's going to be the best one if we do go to war. Their war plan is basically, we're going to throw money at the issue when the time comes, and it works for them. They get the front of an M3 scout car, wheels on the back, wheels on the front, and they marry it to a tracked rear vehicle lorry. And they join those two things together, and they make about 38,000 of these half-track vehicles. This particular one, the M16, is the model with those 4 .50 caliber Brownings in the back, used for anti-aircraft use. By the time they're landed in Normandy, there's not much of the Luftwaffe left as a threat, so they tended to be used on ground targets as well. And they saw service right into the Korean War. Lots of countries use them much longer afterwards. Now, the SDKFZ7, privately owned by Bruce Crompton in his collection. People say, where do these things come from? That one, after the war, there was a pair of them being used in a French quarry. Because again, as soon as you paint it over the sign, if you're an average Frenchman, you're going to be thinking, well, there's a useful vehicle there. So they used for it the winch on it, very good, very useful. And again, some years later, restored, all the bodywork put back on it. So it was like it was in service later on in the war. Now, again, if you like your tanks, you can't help but have heard stories about the Sherman tank. And we're very lucky today. We've got 3 different types of Sherman will be coming on. The first one coming on is one of the early model M4A1. And I know you're all going to fall asleep if I start trying to explain what all these different abbreviations are, but basically M4 is the Sherman tank. A1 means it's got a cast hull. Look at that rounded hull. Cast metal as opposed to being welded. And this one's got the classic radial engine in the back. And doesn't that sound good? Now, what the Americans do, they realize they are going to be, as Roosevelt said, the arsenal of democracy. They're going to have to build a lot of tanks because we need them in Britain. They're going to give them to the Russians as Lend-Lease as well. So they build a number of factories. They start with the M3 Grant tank. You can see inside, they're learning the business. They're getting help from Britain, from France. French casting engineers help with those original castings on the M3 Grant tank. But they're going to build so many, they can't just have one engine type, so they're going to have to go, and also, you know, radial engines like this are wanted by the US Air Force, so they're going to have to find other ways of powering these tanks, hence M4, A2, A3, etc. As you look at the other models, it's really about different engines that are being powering them. This is the right radial. The next vehicle that's coming on, if I can see it in the distance there, I think is our Sherman from the Fury. and that engine is a twin diesel in the back. So a variety of engines were used, hence those different names. And again, if you get very nerdy, if there's a bracket and it says 76 after the name of the tank, that means it's got a 76mm gun on it, as opposed to the 75mm gun that was on those earlier original Shermans. Now the Sherman, again, whatever people tell you about it, if they start criticising it, look them in the eye and say, look, that is a tank that pretty much saved the West. It is a brilliantly simple design, met for a specification, 30 tons. They're going to have to send it around the world. There wasn't war land fighting in America. They knew these tanks were going to have to cross the Atlantic or cross the Pacific to see action. So 30 tons is what's needed. When they first go into action, the Sherman, like the M4A1, those Shermans were used by British forces at the Battle of Alamein in October of '42, and we loved them. They were reliable. You could fix them relatively easily. Reliability, major issue for early British tanks, but they could fix these very well, easily, and there was a lot of them. That was the other great thing. So it gave us breathing space. Don't forget, in Britain, we're trying to build fighters, bombers, we've got a navy. You know, we need all the help we can get to maintain our campaigns around the world. Now with the Sherman, they're arriving in numbers, 75mm gun, the armour thickness on those early Shermans, that was easily a match for the Germans at the time. What retrospectively doesn't seem such a good idea, the Americans quite quickly thought that would be good enough to last the war. And it was only later that they realised, well, hang on a second, when the Panther comes along, when vehicles like the Tiger are out there, we're going to need a more powerful gun. And it's only belatedly did they start getting, just before D-Day, tanks units equipped with this tank with a 76mm gun on it, and they don't see action actually because the crews didn't like the idea of changing just before they went over to Normandy, so they don't see action until a little bit later in the Normandy campaign. But what you've got there is a millimetre wider hole at the end of the barrel, so 76mm, but a much longer gun that can take a larger cartridge case and therefore more velocity behind the round that flies out the end. And don't forget, the Americans originally see the Sherman as really an exploiter, like a British cruiser tank, going through the gap, doing its business behind the lines. If it met an enemy tank, so be it, we might have to take them on, but actually for fighting enemy tanks, we've come up with the idea of the tank destroyer. Vehicles like the M10, later the Hellcat. It was seen as a theory not to work in combat, and retrospectively, very quickly, the Americans realised, hang on a second, we're going to have to do something about it. They pushed the Pershing into operation a bit later on. So there you've got Chris Till's privately owned, lovely M4A1. You've got our tank that again is all kitted out. That's the one you saw in the Fury movie. It was a hero tank there that's on, and we're now going to see another type of Sherman, longer body when he goes round. If you want to be a real spotter, look at the wheels. They're slightly further apart because they had to make this longer to fit yet another type of engine in. And this is the Chrysler multi-bank engine, where they get a whole load of car engines, bolt them together around a single shaft in the middle, and this is only one of 3 running Shermans with multi-banks in the world at the moment. And again, you listen to all those different engine notes, when this one goes past, it's different. As I say, longer body to fit it in, same 75mm gun on there at the front, and this is the welded hull, so this one they call an M4, not the A1 bit. So with the T-34-85 there in the arena moving at the same time, you've got the two tanks that probably won the war for the Allied forces, one in the east and one in the west. Nikolai Koshkin designs the T-34, late 1930s. Russian army says, no thank you, we want the KV-1. Stalin leans over, coughs politely and says, you'll take the T-34. Yes, we'll have the T-34, sir. They put the T-34 into service with a 76mm gun, sloped frontal armour, wide tracks, because Russia at the time has got few metalled roads. After the Battle of Kursk, when they've met the Panther, the Russians again, they design a new tank. It's going to be called the T-44. Again, they realise, isn't it better to evolve things and have radical new things that means whole new factory setups, whole new training regimes for the troops. So instead of coming up with a brand new tank, they come up with a brand new turret. And this means you can fit 3 in this T-34-85 in the turret, commander, gunner and loader. The earlier ones only had 2 cramped people in that turret, and the much larger 85mm gun. Still got a diesel V12 in the back to power it along. Still those nice wide tracks, still sloped armour, they increased it a bit, but they've got so many factories building them. Pretty much every T-34 you look at has got some differences to the next one, because different bits were coming from all over the place. Old ladies in garages cutting gears out with a hacksaw. That's how it got at some points. But the T-34, again, the Russians make them, just like the Americans with the Sherman, in such numbers, it doesn't matter about this higher quality German tank because they can be swamped with numbers. So when you've got the Panther, however clever a bit of technology it is, actually if there's 4 T-34-85s coming along, one of them's going to get you. One of them's going to get round the back and drill a hole through the rear or the side armour on a Panther. So the T-34-85, this particular one, made after the war in Poland, Czechoslovakia made them as well, subtle differences on all of these vehicles, and over time, like many tanks in our collections, private collections, because they tend to have a number of iterations, sometimes they were used by other armies who added bits or took bits off, changed engines, etc. But this is relatively recently, it had a new engine put in, but it's still one of those wartime diesel V12s that's being used there. Uses the famous suspension system designed as well by Walter Christie. And again, you can see there on the side, writing, patriotic writing to back the troops up. But the T-34 made, we think, probably about 70, maybe even 80,000. The Shermans, about 50,000 plus other variants after that were converted. So, you know, these are really big numbers, and that is going to make the difference in industrial age warfare. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the war, Britain has the problem. We leave our tanks behind us at Dunkirk, lots of them in France. Churchill says to the factories, keep making what's in production now. Don't stop to do an improved model. We need tanks now. And that order was repeated, amazingly, into early 1942. The American Sherman gave Britain breathing space. So we were concentrated, Spitfires, Lancasters. We wanted to get back at Germany. We got a navy, we got colonies, we've got an empire. We're fighting around the world. Russia wasn't, just remember that. Russia couldn't give a monkeys about its navy, didn't give a damn about its air force, just built tanks. Britain had to do the lot. So again, from that point of view, those American Shermans were a godsend for Britain. When we did get back to the idea of starting to create tanks, Cromwell family, and then this fella driving around now, which is the Comet. And by now, the pressure on making those aeroplane engines for the fighters and the bombers, we've got enough capacity. So they get the famous Merlin engine, derate it, put it in a tank, and they call it the Meteor. And that gives, for the first time, well over 600 horsepower to a tank. We get a new gun as well. They were hoping to put this gun into the earlier Cromwell. It's a high velocity 77mm. Sometimes people call it like a shortened 17 pounder. It's not actually, it fires the same round as a 17 pounder, but it's got a different case. The case comes from the 3-inch anti-aircraft gun. But that gun firing, armour piercing, disarm, escape, get the words out. Yeah, that gun firing armour-piercing, discarding sabot rounds. In other words, a slug of tungsten in a pot. That round was more effective than the rounds being fired by the German Panther. Now, they're just going to go around. I'll finally shut up for you so you can just enjoy the engine notes of this amazing selection of vehicles. As I said, you can, a little bit later on across the lunch hour, you can go down, the tank park will be open. Obviously we can't open it when we've got vehicle movement going on, but you can pop down there a bit later on and have a closer look at some of these vehicles. Just remember, if you do go up to them, if they've been running around, those exhausts are still probably going to be hot. So do have a word with the crews before touching anything. So that's a Hargo moving off, and they're following behind our M3 Stuart. And as you can imagine, trying to park all these things is not easy when the driver on most armoured vehicles can see directly ahead, not left, not right. Sometimes if you raise your seat up, you can look out the hatch. It always has a lever on the side. Of course, when you come under fire, you pull the lever up, the seat drops down, so you're under armour. Now our Hargo just having one more lap round. The SDKFZ7 that's driving around now, that sometimes towed flat guns. They sometimes mounted 20mm and then 30mm anti-aircraft guns on the back. That may do an SDKFZ/1 or /2. And some of them they actually put armour plate on as well. And just towards the end of the war, they built some of these half tracks with a huge armoured body on, and it was a command and control point for launching V2 missiles. And again, like the German tanks, you'll see on this those interleaved road wheels. The idea being, designed in the 30s in Germany, the idea if you overlap the road wheels, what they're trying to do is spread the weight out over the track of the vehicle. But they do end up using fairly complex needle roller bearings on their tracks. So these, again, they're very impressive looking vehicles, but they are complex and relatively expensive to make. And that's another one of these arguments when you're looking at what was better, what was done well. Actually, the Germans made, they're superb engineers, they made some amazing vehicles, but can you make enough of them in wartime? And again, back to that simplicity of the Sherman and the T-34, that's where, again, many people think the Americans and certainly the Soviets got it right in keeping that simple production. Bit rough on the tank crews if you're looking for equal matches all the time, but again, if you're in a Sherman, the average in Normandy, if you're knocked out, you lose one crew member. But the rest of the crew could go and get another tank because the Americans could supply so many of them. And again, back to that numbers count in warfare. If you want to say something meanwhile, I'll just check for what's coming next. Yeah, sure.